Hello there and welcome to the launch webinar for Sustainable Brand Index Denmark 2022. I'm Eric. I am the founder and CEO of SB Insight, the company behind Sustainable Brand Index. I'm also the founder of Sustainable Brand Index, the study that we're going to spend the coming hour talking about, and especially from a Danish perspective, obviously. The layout of the coming hour is that we're going to talk about the overall development of the Danish market since last year. We're going to talk about the consumer, the sustainable or perhaps unsustainable consumer. And we're also going to talk, of course, spend the most time talking about the brands, the sustainable brands of 2022, the industry winners and also the overall winner this year. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the background of Sustainable Brand Index, obviously. We are Europe's largest brand study on sustainability. The study started out in Sweden in 2011, and then we entered Denmark along with Finland and Norway in 2013, 2 years later. And then a few years later, in 2017, we went to the Netherlands, and the reason for that was because it's fairly similar in some ways when it comes to consumer maturity within sustainability. And then just 2 years ago, we also entered the Baltic countries, so Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. As of now, we're covering 8 markets, and we do have an expansion plan for other geographical markets, so keep an eye out for that in the future. Again, this is actually the 10th year, the 10th ranking and the 10th study that we're publishing in Denmark, so it's been a while now for the Danish market as well. So how do we do it? Well, I'm going to give you the short version of how we perform Sustainable Brand Index. If you want the long version, please feel free to go into our website, www.sbindex.com, and then you can read everything about the methodology and data collection. Just to give you a quick run through though, of course we do a lot of desk research over the year to see what's happening, what are the trends, what questions do we need to ask consumers in the upcoming study. And then the actual data collection for Sustainable Brand Index consists of 2 field works, so to speak. So 2 quantitative web surveys where we ask first, in the first one we focus a lot on the brands. How do you perceive, as a consumer, perceive different brands from different sustainability perspectives? And then in the second quantitative web survey, we go more in depth and ask, what are the reasons for this? Why are these brands perceived in this way? And then, of course, we ask a lot of our other relevant questions regarding sustainability as well. All in all, for the 8 markets, we have interviewed 70,000 consumers this year, a nationally representative sample of each population, of course, between 16 and 75 years old. And all in all, brand-wise, we have analyzed and collected insights on 1,500 brands in all these countries across 35 industries. And for Denmark, of course, that we're going to talk about today, these are the numbers. So we have interviewed a bit more than 9,000, so 9,500 Danish consumers, nationally representative sample, of course. And we have looked at a total of 233 brands in 23 industries. So we added a few brands. For those of you who watched last year, you might notice that we added some brands this year, and that's what we do every year actually. And the brand selection, just final note I want to make on the how we do the study part, is the brand selection is based on market share and brand awareness. So you cannot choose to be in the study or out of the study either. We decide. That's how it goes. Now that we've done that, I actually want to involve you guys a bit, because we do have this question for you, and I want you to vote, because there is a poll coming up in the chat in this webinar. So what I want to ask you is actually, what single sustainability area do you think that Danish consumers want companies to prioritize the most? So we have a solid 48% for climate change, 49%. So yeah, it's quite interesting. Recycling and reuse quite high as well. Not too many people thinking that working conditions and packaging are key issues for consumers. Climate change taking the lead. All right, I will of course share with you the result in just a while. Well, the result, but the actual answer. Let's see who was wrong and who was right. Super, let's continue then. And I want to explain to you the purpose of Sustainable Brand Index. And as some of you who have followed us over the year, you might recognize this sustainable perspective, as we call it, whereas sustainability, as we see it, has moved from being, irrelevant to the brand, basically, to becoming more and more integrated into the brand and actually being a the single most important reason or single most important part that you as a consumer assess when you want to choose a brand in an industry, for example. So, and of course we also hope for a future where we only will have sustainable brands. It's going to be mandatory to be a sustainable brand, so we won't be talking about brands and sustainable brands, but those two will be fully integrated, so to speak. So that's really the foundation, I could say, about of the study and why we do what we do. Of course, the purpose as well is to drive the agenda within sustainability. We want to drive it forward. We do it from our perspective. We work with brands and communication, so we think that the more we talk about it and the more you as brands talk about sustainability and also the ranking, in this case, how people perceive you, we think that creates, you know, more interest, more questions, more engagement among regular people, which creates a positive cycle. So the more you talk, the more people are going to wonder and question and engage in the work that you're doing, so to speak. There is actually one particular question that I just want to address real quickly this year, because we do get some questions about this. You know, what is the point of a study that only looks at sustainability perception? And I think this is a very valid question. I mean, what is the point? And this is something that we're really looking at ourselves, obviously. We've been doing it for 12 years now in total, 10 in Denmark. The reason is still very much the same. Again, this positive cycle. The more you talk, the more we talk about it, the more people will engage and the more interested they will be in sustainability. But also, this year we actually decided to take a bit of a look like, okay, what are the effects of the Sustainable Brand Index? And we found out a few different things. So when we looked at the ranking, which is of course very much the tip of the iceberg of Sustainable Brand Index, we noticed that there are two significant effects that we can see in our different markets. First one is we do see that the ranking and the fact there is this competitive thing, so to speak, in it, is that we see an increased interest among both board and management teams in sustainability as a whole. You know, you want to lead the list, both of course in perception, but also in the work that you're doing. So we do see an increased interest. We also see that actually the ranking also makes for increased cooperation between marketing, communication, sustainability departments. So to avoid greenwashing, of course, you know, where they have to work better together. So that's just some of the effects of the ranking that we publish. If we look more at the insights that we provide for separate companies, if you're a brand on the list, you're eligible to actually contact us, of course, and then get, if you want to, an insight report on your specific brand. And we do see that, having worked with a lot of brands over the years, we see some examples. For example, one very large international company, they, based on our insights, they decided to establish a whole sustainability department because they realized we have to actually, you know, deliver on these demands and also these things that consumers assume that we're doing. And another thing is we helped one company just by, you know, providing insights. They decided to actually set science-based targets, and they just got them approved a few weeks ago. So that's also a very concrete thing that I think Sustainable Brand Index actually brings to the market, so to speak. So that's really some of the points of the study. Let's move into the Danish market a bit more specifically. And of course, there are some overarching indicators that I want us to look at. So first of all, this one, which some of you have watched this before and followed us over the years, you know that one of the key overarching indicators we look at is the interest in sustainability, obviously, but also in this case, how much people actually, or how large a share of the population that talk about sustainability on somewhat a regular basis. So sometimes or often they discuss sustainability with friends, family, etc. And as you can see, if we look at the long-term trend, which I always think is the most important one, it's going up. So if you look from 13 up until today, it is a positive trend, quite a significant one, from 42% to this year's 62%. Of course, there are things that happen over the years. For example, we had the climate meeting in Paris in the end of 15, which really affected the results for 16. Donald Trump, you know, his entrance on the world stage really took down the interest a bit, to be honest, or at least switched it away for a while. Then we had the activism around the climate change, which really increased it. And then, of course, the pandemic, which we're still very much in, even though we might have forgotten it a bit due to other horrific crises. That also has an effect. And this year you can see we have a slightly positive development in Denmark. I would argue almost neutral, but still, let's call it slightly neutral. And the reason for that is, basically we're still have been very much in the pandemic. People has not really switched away in the focus from that up until a few weeks ago for obvious reasons with Ukraine. We also see a lot of generic communication. We don't see that brands communicate very, it's not very good, to be honest, to be very, very clear about that. And we do see that it's generic and people tend to be a bit worn out. They also tend to be we do see a tendency that they're worn out because of the fact that, they get a lot of promises both from maybe governments and companies, but they don't see real progress. So we do see, I do see signs of a fatigue, which is a bit of a worry, I would say. One thing also that I want to mention, which might sound a bit mundane, but it is actually very important, is that we haven't had during 2021 any big documentaries on sustainability. During 2020, for example, we had the Attenborough documentary, A Life on Our Planet, which was really significant in terms of getting people's interest. But if we look at these kind of sources for sustainability information, we do see that documentaries, especially in Denmark as in Sweden, as you can see, is actually quite important. And again, we haven't seen any, maybe last year, this kind of significant documentary having created that kind of waves, basically, or increased interest, so to speak. So that is one of many, of course, reasons why we haven't seen this maybe upswing in discussions around sustainability. Otherwise, increased media reporting is also important in Denmark as in the other countries. Things that actually maybe deviate a bit for Denmark is a bit further down, increased communication about sustainability from companies. So we do see that Danes claim, at least, to be a bit more affected by sustainability communication that they see on the market than do other Nordic consumers in this case. Moving on then to the answer to the question that I just asked you, what are the general sustainability priorities? And as I saw before, most of you, a majority actually said that climate change is probably the single most important issue for consumers in Denmark. Unfortunately, it's only number 6 this year, as you can see. We have the winner, which is recycling and reuse of old material. Some of you were on that as well, so that was the second area that you chose, I think. So good for you. And then we have good working conditions in domestic workplaces. We have good working conditions abroad in factories, etc. And then we have domestic production, so bringing home production and having domestic production and work opportunities. So we do see some large differences, as you can see from last year, especially the fact that recycling and reuse, having gone from a fairly high level, as you can see last year, to still being in the lead, still the top priority, but significantly lower. Same goes for climate change, having been the second most important area according to Danish consumers, now actually only number 6. The reason is not so much what happened this year, to be honest, but actually the year before, because we did see that the pandemic, not only in Denmark but also in the other Nordic countries, really created kind of a crisis sentiment, and that was really connected by many consumers to environmental issues and degradation of the earth and the climate as examples. Those are really two very clear areas for people to actually, they were worried about, and they really saw as, this is a high priority. So I would say this year is more of a maybe normal level of priority. However, still considering the fact that it was so high last year, especially climate change, I would say it's also a bit worrying, perhaps, that it comes so low. It is quite low. It's lower in Norway. You can always be maybe perhaps a bit comforted about that, but it's still quite low in this case. But actually, again, just want to emphasize that it's rather what happened last year, not this year, that is really the deviation, so to speak. And also important in this one is that, the top areas here are things that people prioritize the most, not necessarily so that the things in the other end are non-important. It's just less important, relatively speaking. So that's a very important point to make. All right, and I just mentioned this, what people worry about and what things are serious. So this is actually something we looked at a bit this year. If you look at this graph here, you can see that on the x-axis, the lying one, you have, what are people worried about? What are Danes worried about? And then the other one, the y-axis, you have, what do they think is serious? This is a serious threat to me, to society, to the planet, etc. And as we can see, which is actually unique for Denmark, I still have to say, which is also very interesting given what we just looked at, is that climate change is, as you can see here, at the top when it comes to, you know, this is the most serious topic, so to speak. So it is very serious. And people are actually also, as you can see, quite worried about it. But still, there are other areas as well that people want companies to prioritize. But it is still a high level of seriousness and worry. What people are most worried about in Denmark, as for in Sweden, as in Norway, which we just launched last week, we do see that this air and water pollution, which is of course very much connected to health as well, is the thing that people are most worried about. And Danes not that worried about equality and labor conditions. Of course, this is all relative as well, so let's not overinterpret, but still interesting to see, as well as public health, not that worrying either. Even though I have to mention, if you look at the axis, the levels are still fairly high. It's high levels of both worry and seriousness for all these areas. So that's also important to emphasize. Moving on from, these kind of overarching things, a bit more into the sustainable or perhaps unsustainable consumer. Let's have a look. For those of you who have watched us before and followed Sustainable Brand Index over these years, we actually have followed these groups for 10 years now. We call them Ego, Moderate, Smart and Dedicated. We named them after we make the analysis. We don't go around asking people if they're ego. You might guess yourselves how the answers would be. So basically these are groups that mirror how people behave when it comes to sustainability. So ego, as you might guess, not behaving that sustainably, basically. Moderate, most people, if we may call them that, followers, they don't really push the agenda themselves, but they look at what others do and then they might try things that are a bit more mainstream nowadays, so to speak. Whereas we have the smart group, really, forward-thinking, progressive group, but definitely always with this balance between, what's in it for me and what's in it for the world. So really delicate balance there. They don't buy anything just because it's sustainable, so to speak. It has to be good for them. And then we have the dedicated group, which are a bit more like that, meaning, sustainability is at the top of the list, no matter the industry or no matter what they're gonna do or what they're gonna buy, for example. So yeah, and let's have a look at the sizes of these groups and just the development. As I just mentioned, we followed them since 2013 in Denmark as well as the other countries. The sizes are similar in all Nordic countries. It's good to know. There are some differences. What I actually want to emphasize for Denmark is that, as you can see, the smart group back in 2013 was actually only 18%, whereas the ego group was 34%. But now, since last year, those are actually more or less at the same level. So we have seen a positive development, I would say. The smart group has grown and the ego group has decreased a bit. So I think that is really, it's a positive development, because it means we do see a more sustainable behavior in the Danish market. Also, I want to emphasize a bit that this dedicated group, even though it's a very small group, as you can see, it has gone from 6% back in 2013 to 10% this year, and also an increase from last year in Denmark, as we can see. Small group, yes, but we do think that this is actually a up and coming group, so to speak, because we do see that the people that are joining this group, so to speak, they are the young people, so Generation Z, which we talk about a lot, or I suppose most of you talk about a lot as well in your company, so to speak. So that's a booming group, I would say, in the coming years as well. Whereas the moderate group, as you can see, more or less the same level. So what we see over the years is that you go from ego into moderate and then to smart, and some people might progress even into dedicated, but smart is usually the end destination, so to speak. We have another question for you. This is more concerning communication rather than branding, which is of course very much intertwined. But when it comes to sustainability communication, do you think that Danish consumers this year compared to last year have more or less trust in what you're saying, basically? So has trust gone up in sustainability messaging and communication, or has it gone down? 74% so far, yes? Fairly clearly there, yes, 75%, all right. I don't think I have to look at that anymore. It's very clear which direction it's going. 74, 75%, all right, that's good. Let's see if you're right or you're wrong. I can just tell you before we go that when we did this in Norway, it was the other way around. People were really confident that, it's going up, it's going in the right direction. So this is also a cultural question, I would say, depending on maybe what kind of mood you have going in, so to speak. Let's come back to that. Let's focus a bit more on the ranking. Yeah, and I just want to explain quickly for you. The ranking in Sustainable Brand Index, great thing, we love it, but it's really the tip of the iceberg, really overarching thing that of course creates a lot of interest and drives the agenda, which we're very happy about. What is it based on? Well, basically it's based on two different areas. So we call it environmental responsibility and we call it social responsibility. And the definition that we use for those areas, that's the global goals for sustainable development, the 17 goals. So we take the goals that are environmentally related, so to speak, we put them in environmental responsibility, and then we take the socially oriented ones and we put that as a definition in social responsibility. So that's what we use when we ask people about these different areas. And as a brand, when we look at your brand, for example, and ask questions about it, we look at two parameters in overarching. So first of all, of course, awareness. How much do people know? How many people have an idea that you're actually working with these things? And then, of course, as we say here, quality, but this is really attitude. What are they positive? Are they negative? Are they neutral? And what gives you the ranking score, which in turn gives you a ranking position on the overall ranking, that is the share of positives. So the share of positives, it's a top box method as it's called. The share of positives. So we have a high share of positives. The higher it is, the higher you go on the ranking, basically. And that is put on top of each other. So environmental responsibility, share of positives, social responsibility, share of positives on top of each other. So the score goes from 0 to 200%. So that's just good to know. And of course, we're going to dive into the ranking in just a short while. But what I do want to address also is, what drives the ranking? Other than things that you're doing. I mean, if you communicate, if you build your brand with sustainability as a brick, so to speak, or many bricks, that's one thing. But there are also things that you maybe cannot affect that much, what you are and who you are, so to speak. So this is something that we actually looked at this year to see, okay, we know that there are a few things that actually affect people's, perception going in looking at your brand. So first of all, we know that origin, are you a Danish brand in Denmark? That is something that is usually positive. History, have you been around for a long time, or are you a newcomer, more perhaps perceived as a bit more innovative sometimes? The ownership, is it family owned, is it cooperative, is it state owned, publicly owned, etc. And also, of course, the industry affiliation, are you in an industry that people perceive as, very sustainable or maybe a bit less sustainable? So those are things that we looked at this year. And we also have numbers for each of the brands to be able to say, this is how much it affects your brand. What I just want to share with you today is that there are some things that are generally very true, which is in this case, for example, if you are a domestic brand, yes, you do have an advantage. You will be, not by definition, but you have chances of being assessed as more sustainable. People, Denmark, in Denmark, think, for example, that domestic brands, Danish brands in Denmark are more sustainable than foreign brands, for example. The average score for these brands are higher indeed. Another thing, as you can see to the right here, that we looked at this year is the brand awareness part, because we do get a lot of questions about, it's only the big brands at the top, the ones with a large market share and a huge media budget, etc. And I mean, yes, I get what you're saying, but when we looked at this year, looking at how much does this correlate the brand awareness to the ranking score and the ranking position, we do see that that's not a very good explainer, to be honest. It's not really that. You have a lot of famous brands further down in the ranking as well, to be very clear about it. I'm not going to go into details, but not a key explainer basically to having a good ranking score in sustainable branding. Of course, it can help. I'm not saying that. It's depending on the brand, but it's not a general, conclusion that you can draw in that sense. However, moving into the one thing that I also mentioned, industry affiliation. Do we belong to an industry that is perceived as, sustainable, positive impact or negative impact? Here we have, not all, but I think almost all at least industries that we look at. First of all, we can see, I know it because I've just presented Norway and Sweden last week. Danes are much more negative I mean, this is actually quite interesting to see. For example, Norwegian, they perceive most industries to be very good, positive impact, great for humanity. Whereas Danes are very much the opposite. As you can see here, the red bars are very, sometimes very high, but also very frequent, so to speak. So Danes are definitely, usually we say you're less positive, because that's usually what we see. But in this case, when it comes to industry sustainability image, you're actually quite negative. So this is very clear. So, I mean, yes, it's good to be in the pension industry, in food and beverage, electricity and heating, fairly good starting point. Whereas, aviation, airlines, fuel, travel, fast food, and even beauty, not as simple. You start out on minus, basically. And this is absolutely something that will affect, how well do you do in the ranking, and how do people actually perceive you. So this is challenging for some brands, obviously, to the right in this graph, and a bit perhaps good for others that belong to an industry that people perceive to be at least somewhat, having somewhat of a positive impact. Moving into the actual ranking then, and the ranking score. This is the average ranking score for all the Nordic countries, as you may see. Denmark is the lowest, and connecting back to what I just said, we have seen and we still see that if you compare Danish consumers to Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish, we do see that Danes tend to be a bit harder to impress, meaning what I just said before, that you're a bit less positive, not necessarily more negative. We did see that when it came to the industries, but when we look at specific brands, it's not that you're more negative, but rather that it takes more to impress Danish consumers, basically. However, having said that, we do see a positive development this year from 39% to 41%. Again, I have to remind you the maximum score here is 200, so there is still a long way to go for all brands. But I also want to point to the fact that you have gone in Denmark from back when we started the study in 13, from 16% average score, and then of course up and down a bit, and now we're at 41. So there is a positive development. I want to say that it's moving along. People are getting more and more impressed and more positive with what brands are doing within sustainability. So we do see this kind of positive development, I would say, in general. Of course, this deviates from one brand to another sometimes. But in general, we do see that the work you're doing when it comes to branding, communication, is actually having an impact over the long term. And that's, I think, at least somewhat encouraging. So let's look at the brands that are actually had the largest jumps from last year. And I mean, you have to be a bit careful when looking at this, because positions change a bit from year to year, but let's nevertheless give a hand to the ones that actually increased the most. For example, Scandlines, we have at the very top, they increased 93 spots since last year, which is quite a lot, as you might guess. And then we have kind of a mix. We have Joe and the Juice, we have Danica Pension, we have Fanta. I mean, there's really a mix here, as you can see, and even a car brand at the bottom of that list. So yeah, it's a bit of a mix this year for the climbers. If we look at the droppers, I mean, what stands out here perhaps is that even though Scandlines went up quite a lot, we do see that Stena Line actually went down quite a lot, 74 spots. So that's something that is obviously very much connected to each of the brands, I would say, rather than perhaps the industry as a whole. And otherwise, it's also fairly mixed when it comes to the droppers in this case. It's everything from candy to hotels to beauty as well. So it's a bit of a mix, definitely. But let's move into the happy part and see a bit more of the industry winners of this year 2022. Here you have them, all of them, the 23 different industries that we're looking at in Denmark. And I think what I want to mention here is that when we had the Norwegian seminar last week and we had the Swedish one last week, we did see quite a lot of new industry winners. I would say roughly around 10 to 15 depending on the country. In Denmark we have 0 new industry winners. It's actually the same as last year. We do have some changes, which is more, for example, we have Trea in telecommunication, but that is actually more because of the fact that we removed TDC, which is no longer a B2C brand, as you may know. So, and we also split the industry, which is home appliances and electronics, into stores and brands. So Computersalg is actually the winner in the store part, so to speak. But otherwise, it's very or identical as last year. So a bit of a standstill there. We have strong brands leading each of the industries. That's probably the conclusion we can draw in Denmark in this case. Let's move on to the top 10. Some of you may have seen it this morning, but let's go through it. Here we have it, number 2 to 10. So we have Tesla, we have Urtekram, we have Irma, Friland, IKEA, we have Årstiderna, Coop, Tise, and then Lego, yeah? So big, both domestic, but also, of course, foreign brand, especially, as you may notice, IKEA and Tesla. But otherwise, a lot of domestic brands, and Lego has really had a positive journey over the years, and now they're actually number 2. Coop, as you might remember, have been previously winning the Sustainable Brand Index in Denmark for quite a few years. Also with Irma, which is one of their brands, as you all know. So there was a domination, I would say, from the Coop group. But now, since last year, we do see a different winner, and it is, as you might have guessed and even seen, a new winner and the same winner as last year. So Rema 1000 is the winner of Sustainable Brand Index 2022 in Denmark. And I would say this is very impressive. We have seen a very impressive journey from this brand when it comes to sustainability and the perception of consumers. We do see that consumers are very impressed with specific areas such as both the local connection that Rema 1000 has, but also, for example, their work with food waste, which is another clear area where we see that consumers perceive Rema 1000 to have a very clear impact in society. So, again, congratulations to Rema 1000. We're very happy for you and defending this title as Denmark's most sustainable brand 2022. What I want to mention now, because for Rema 1000 as well as for everyone else, all of the 233 brands, there is a tailored insight report, analysis report, or strategy report, there are 2 different ones, available for your brand. So if you're interested in knowing more, how are we perceived, what are the drivers behind that, consumer behavior, trends on the market, regulations, how can we communicate without being accused of greenwashing and also without actually greenwashing. Those are things that we look at in each of these tailored reports for your brand. So please reach out to us afterwards if you're interested in knowing more about that. And talking about greenwashing, I do want to talk a bit about the state of sustainability communication. So what is going on when it comes to sustainability communication? And you did answer this question just a while ago. What has the trust in sustainability communication gone up or down? And we're going to have a look at that now. So first, to the left here, even though most of you are going to look to the right now, but anyway, to the left here, what you see is, how interested are Danish consumers in sustainability communication in general. And we do see a negative development. So there are more people saying, I don't like sustainability communication. I don't think it's important, basically. I don't think it has a purpose in that sense. Whereas we also see that the ones saying, I am positive to sustainability communication, still a lot of people, 48%, yes. But we do see a slight decrease there as well, among those people saying that I think it's important with sustainability communication and I want to see more, so to speak. It has a purpose, it has a function. Moving on to the right graph here, which is the question that I asked you and which you quite correctly answered. As you may have seen here already, yes, we do see a decrease. We see that up from 26% to 31% of Danish consumers say that I do not trust what is being said in general when it comes to sustainability communication, and then also down from 29 to 26% the ones that say, yeah, I do trust it. So we do have an overall movement of 8 percentage points in the wrong direction, if I may say so. So people trust sustainability communication less, which is definitely a problem and a challenge. And we all talk about this a lot. We talk about greenwashing, we talk about the quality of the communication. I also talk a lot about generic communication, the fact that you see sustainability communication, you can just remove the brand and put another one there and you wouldn't notice the difference. And that is really what we kind of experience right now. So to help you a bit, we actually this year performed an ad test on different kinds of sustainability communication. So what we did was we tested different kind of messages, focusing on different kinds of, well, as you see here, we have what we call labeled, which is basically you have a third-party certification, an eco label, for example. We have what we call good for me, which is when you really connect the message with, you can save sustainably but also make a lot of money, so to speak. So you have a balance, really appealing to the smart group, as I talked about earlier. We have what we call fact-based, which is when you really use the facts. You talk about perhaps numbers, percentages, really try to be clear with how you have done, what you have done to decrease your emissions, for example. And we have what we call aspirational, which is very much this, we're going here, 2030, we're going to be carbon neutral, for example, really pointing to the future. Generic, which is, as it sounds a bit more like, we work sustainably, we take responsibility for our supply chain, not really maybe saying something, just using the word sustainable. And then we have emotional, connecting, often talking about perhaps children or future generations, etc. So as you can see, why I've been rambling on here, you may see that, the labels, that's really what's credible according to consumers. 54%, whereas the others are, fairly tight, good for me, fact-based and aspirational, sure, between 36 and 38% of people saying that, I think this is fairly credible, whereas still 1/4 actually saying I don't trust it. And then at the very bottom we have this generic, where you only talk about, we work sustainably, we take responsibility, and also emotional, we talk about children and, the future in a very, diffuse kind of way. So it is challenging with sustainability communication. Hopefully this can be somewhat of a guidance. Of course, we have much more material on this as well available, but this was just to give you a bit of a teaser, and hopefully you could learn something and draw some conclusions from that. Talking about credibility and communication, one thing that I think is usually a challenge for many brands and for consumers as well is that, there are a lot of fancy words being thrown around, and what we have looked at as well, just as last year, is, what do people actually know about these nice words as carbon neutrality or carbon footprint or carbon offsetting, or of course the sustainable development goal. As you can see, the knowledge is actually quite low. These are Danish consumers claiming to know. That's, as we all know, claiming to know and knowing, not the same thing. So, but claiming to know, we have approximately the highest number is for carbon neutrality, where we see 36%. So roughly, whenever you use any of these terms in your communication, you're missing at least 2/3 of the population, because they're not really sure what you're talking about. And this is really a problem when it comes to credibility, because people don't like to feel stupid, and when they don't understand, they also tend to blame it on you, saying, it's your fault and you're probably not serious, and this is nothing that I understand, so it can't be that good, basically. I do want to emphasize one positive thing. It is that it's going up. As you can see, almost all, actually all, even though it's a bit marginal for some, we do see that the knowledge levels are going up for all of these different kind of terms, which is positive. But I still think it's very low, and I think that's really a challenge when communicating about sustainability. Now we talked a bit about the situation before and now, and we're going to talk a bit about the future. So where do we go from here? Well, that's a broad question that I'm going to try to at least narrow down a bit. Of course, it's tough to have this webinar without talking about some obvious trends or context factors that we see in the world today. Obviously the pandemic, even though we have kind of forgotten about that due to the situation and the war in Ukraine since a few weeks. It's still there, and we can see when we analyze and look at this a bit, we do see that the short-term effect, as we kind of saw regarding the key general sustainability priorities for consumers, the short-term effect was that, went up a bit, increased interest in climate change, in other environmental aspects. However, we do see now, not necessarily connected to Ukraine, but actually even before that, we did see that kind of pandemic effect, which really increased people's, sense of urgency, has actually decreased a bit. And also, we're not as sure that the pandemic is a positive driver for sustainability in that sense anymore, so to speak. So it is a bit less, as we can see now. And this, just jumping to the IPCC report that was published about climate change a few weeks ago. There is a talk, as you all know, and there are reasons for that, obviously, that they talk in that about climate adaptation rather than mitigation. And we do see a tendency when it comes to that consumers might actually feel that, it's over. We lost the race. It's no point anymore. And that's the really kind of a discourse and kind of a narrative that we want to avoid, that people actually give up just because science, in their eyes, have said that, now it's not possible anymore. We missed the train, so to speak. So that's worrying as well, I would say. And of course, not leaving without talking about Ukraine, the awful situation and the awful fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine, a democratic country in Europe. Trying to connect it a bit to this, what we're doing here, and sustainability and branding. I mean, we will probably see, of course, we do see now an increased focus on, safety in each of the countries, public safety for people and defense spending, etc. There will be, of course, some changes, has already been when it comes to ESG investments and what is ESG and isn't. Some people have come to their senses. Also, to be honest, we will probably in the future see more focus on the domestic markets. Countries will turn more inwards, both in terms of course, defense and security, but also supply chains, also self-sufficiency of different products, etc. So I think we will see an increased focus on social issues as well as domestic focus, so to speak, talking about their own country more than perhaps the global perspective in the future. Those could be some impacts of the situation as we see it right now. And when it comes to sustainable branding, which is of course what we're talking about here, we do see, as I talked about previously, that the long-term trend is positive. Danes are more positive when it comes to sustainable brands and perceiving sustainability work from brands. So it's going in the right direction. Your efforts have made an impact, I would say. So yes, we do also see that companies dare to communicate. We do see a lot of sustainability communication. I don't think there's anyone who would argue the opposite. So we have a large quantity of sustainability communication. However, again, which I mentioned before, we do see a lot of generic communication, not really distinguishing, not really maybe basing it in their brand identity. We also see simplified communication. I want to see clarified, I don't want to see simplified. And this leads to the fact that we have a challenge now. We have to move, to use a cliche, from quantity, a lot of sustainability communication, to quality. We have to make perhaps a bit less, but make it much, much better. That's the key challenge, I would say, for all brands and all industries at the moment. And how do we do that? Well, of course, this is where we come in as well. So you may contact us and require our help. What I want to give you today for free is, of course, some pointers. There is a real importance of educating yourselves internally. Even though you who might be watching this are well aware of sustainability and why you're working with it and why it's important for your companies, most of your colleagues probably aren't. We do see that whenever I educate people and have training sessions for companies, that's usually the first thing they stumble upon. We don't really know what we mean by sustainability. We don't really know why it's important for us. Well, then you have a problem creating credible and qualitative communication. The other one is reality check. It's really important to understand that you have an idea and a vision of how your business is working and how perfect it is, how good it is. The consumer idea is usually quite different. This is again and again visualized, for example, within the food industry when we're looking at chicken companies or, animal welfare, that you have an idea of, this is good animal welfare. Well, might not be in the eyes of consumers. I'm not saying they're right and you're wrong, neither am I saying the opposite, but it's just important to make a reality check, how do they see this? Third thing, connect to your identity. The reason we see so much generic communication is that brands tend to look at other brands and say, hey, this is what we want to talk about. Do we have to talk about climate change as well? All right, maybe you have. Not saying that, but maybe you have. But you have to go back. Who are we? How do we talk about sustainability? Just as any communication, base it in your brand identity, because now it's very much loose, so to speak, and not connected to who you are. Fourth, integrate. We still see a lot of silo thinking. This is our communication, this is our sustainability communication. This is something we've been talking about for 10 years. Still we don't see it, the integration. Sustainability needs to be an integral part of regular communication, so to speak, not a thing going on, not someone working 30% with that over here, or we have a small team with that over there, so to speak. It has to be integrated, both in communication but also in the teams behind it. finally, the thing that we see with sustainability communication, that we still have a lot of functional thinking. Yeah, we need more creativity, we need more creative brains when it comes to sustainability communication. But now it's still very much a box. You know, whenever you're going to talk about sustainability, it's very much like we have decreased our emissions with this much, which is very like square and hard for people to actually understand. Is it a lot? Is it a little? Are you good? Are you not? So to speak. And it becomes very, very boring, to be honest. So I think that there are keys for that. Humor, of course, one way of going at it. I am actually getting to the end here, and what I want to mention before you drop off and go to lunch, we are more than just a ranking, of course, and I do want to emphasize that if you're interested in knowing more about your brand, your competitors, how you're perceived within 30 different sustainability areas relevant to your brand, as well as what consumers think you should prioritize, how they behave, but also, of course, looking at the context, the trends on the market. We're also looking, what is the value of a sustainable brand? Can you count it in sales, market share, in brand equity? Those are things that we look at as well. So if you're interested in this, please contact me or one of my colleagues. You will find all the information at the website. And also, of course, if you haven't done it already today, the official report for Sustainable Brand Index 2022 in Denmark is out there. You log on to sbindex.com/Denmark and you download it now, and you get a lot of nice reading for free. But there are more in-depth insights for your brand as well. So please, again, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much for listening today, and have a great rest of the week.